You guys want to mute yourself? I will get started. Chapter 8, Mightier Than the Sword. 2 days later, the photographer came to take class pictures. The fifth grade picture would be taken last, right after lunch. They gave Nick and his secret agents plenty of time, and they whispered something into the ear of every fifth grader. All the individual pictures had been taken, and finally it was time for the group picture. Everyone was lined up on the auditorium stage. Everyone's hair looked great, and everyone was smiling. But when the photographer said, "Say cheese," no one did. Instead, every kid said, "Frindle!" And they held up one for the camera to see. The photographer was out of film, so that shot was the only fifth grade group picture he took. 6 of the fifth grade teachers were not pleased, and Mrs. Granger was furious. No one had really wanted to make teachers mad. It was just fun. It also got all the kids in school talking about the new word. And when people pick up a new word, they say it all the time. The kids at Lincoln Elementary School liked Nick's new word a lot, but not Mrs. Granger. The day after the class picture, she made an announcement to each of her classes, and she posted a notice on the bulletin board by the main office. Anyone who is heard using the word Frindle instead of the word pen will stay after school and write this sentence 100 times. I am writing this as a punishment with a pen. Mrs. Granger. But that just made everyone want to use Nick's word even more. Staying after school with the lone Granger became a badge of honor. There were kids in her classroom every day after school. It went on like that for a couple of weeks. One day, near the end of 7th period, Mrs. Granger asked Nick to come talk to her after school. "This is not a detention, Nicholas. I just want to talk." Nick was excited. It was kind of like a conference during a war. One side waves a white flag, and the generals come out and talk. Generals Nicholas Allen. Nick liked the sound of that a lot. He stuck his head in Mrs. Granger's doorway after school. "You wanted to talk to me?" "Yes, Nicholas. Please come in and sit down." When he was settled, she looked at him and said, "Don't you think this Frindle business has gone far enough? It's just a disruption to the school, don't you think?" Nick swallowed hard, but he said, "I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just fun, and it's a real word. It's not a bad word, just different. And besides, that's how words really change, isn't it? That's what you said." Mrs. Granger sighed. "It is how a word could be made up brand new, I suppose. But the word pen, should it really be replaced by another word? The word pen has a long, rich history. It comes from the Latin word for feather, pinna. It started to become our word pen because quills made from feathers were some of the first writing tools ever made. It is a word that comes from somewhere. It makes sense, Nicholas. But Frindle makes just as much sense to me," said Nick. "After all, didn't someone just make up the word pinna too?" That got a spark from Mrs. Granger's eyes, but all she said was, "Then you're not then you are not going to stop this?" Nick looked right in her eyes and said, "Well, me and I mean a bunch of my friends and I took an oath about using the word, and we have to keep our promises. And besides, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I like my word. Nick tried to look brave, look like a good general should. Very well then. I thought it would end up this way. Mrs. Granger pulled a fat white envelope from her desk drawer and held it up. This is a letter I have written to you, Nicholas. Nicholas held out his hand, thinking she was going to give it to him, but she didn't. I'm going to send it to you. I'm not going to send it to you until this is all over. I want you to sign your name and put today's date across the back of the envelope. When you read it, whenever that may be, you will know this it is the same letter and that I have not made any changes to it. There you can see. This is weird, Nick said to himself. But to Mrs. Granger, he said, sure. And he sighed and signed his name in his best cursive and put the date under it. Then Mrs. Granger stood up abruptly and said, that is all for today, Nicholas, and may the best word win. There was a frown on her face, but her eyes were different, almost happy. And Nick was halfway down the hall before it hit him. She likes this war. She wants to win real bad. Walking to school the next day, Pete had a great idea. How about we see if we can get every kid in the whole fifth grade to go up and ask Mrs. Granger, can I borrow a Frindle? You mean, Mrs. Granger, may I borrow a Frindle? Dave said. Got to use good grammar. Don't want to upset dangerous Grangerous. Sounds good to me, said Nick. She can't keep everyone after school, can she? Almost 80 kids stayed after school with Mrs. Granger that day. They filled her room and spilled out into the hallway. The principal had to stay late to help, and they had to arrange 2 special late buses to get all the kids home. The next day, all the 5th graders did it again, and so and so did a lot of other students. Over 200 kids. Parents called to complain. The bus drivers threatened to go on strike, and then the school board and superintendent got involved. And about this time, the principal of Lincoln Elementary School paid a little visit to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Allen. She wanted to talk to them about their son, the one in 5th grade, the one named Nick. Chapter 9. Chess. Mrs. Margaret Chantham had been the principal of Lincoln Elementary School for 18 years. She knew Mr. and Mrs. Allen because they had all served together on the building committee when the old Lincoln School was torn down and the new one was built 6 years ago. When she telephoned on the afternoon of October 1st to set up the meeting, Mrs. Chantham had asked Nick to be there too. It was 6:30 when she knocked, and Nick opened the door. Good evening, Nick, she said. No smile. Hi, Mrs. Chantham, Nick said, backing away as she filled the doorway. She was a large person, as tall as Nick's dad, and with wide shoulders. Nick guessed she would play linebacker on a football team, because that's what his dad played in college. Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Allen, she said, stepping into the living room. She was wearing a long black raincoat with a red silk scarf tied loosely around her neck. She kept her coat on, but took off the scarf and tucked it back into her left pocket. She shook hands swiftly with both of Nick's parents before sitting down on the chair to the left of the couch. Nick's mom and dad sat on the couch, and Nick sat in the rocking chair that faced Mrs. Chantham across the low coffee table. This is not an easy visit for me. We are having some trouble at school, and it appears to be Nick is in the middle of it. Then, while Nick's parents listened, Mrs. Chantham laid out the story as she saw it. Nick encouraging the other students to use his new word, Mrs. Granger forbidding it, the ruined fifth grade class picture, hundreds of kids staying after school, and a general feeling that there was a rebellion at school, with no one respecting the rules anymore. Nick watched his mom and dad while Mrs. Chantham talked, looking from one face to another. His dad was listening carefully, nodding and frowning. He looked embarrassed about the trouble, but his mom looked kind of annoyed. And when Mrs. Chantham finished her story, Nick's mom was the first one to speak. But doesn't it all seem like a lot of fuss about something pretty silly? Nick sat quietly, but in his mind he shouted, "Hurrah for Ma! Hurrah for mothers everywhere!" His mom wasn't annoyed with him. She was annoyed with Mrs. Granger, maybe even annoyed with Mrs. Chantham. This was getting interesting. Mrs. Allen was still talking to the principal. I mean, is there really any harm in children making up a funny new word and saying it? Does there have to be a rule that a word like this may not be used? Mrs. Chantham sighed. Yes, I suppose it does seem silly. But Mrs. Granger thinks it's rather like keeping children from saying ain't. There have to be standards. That's why we have dictionaries. And really, the problem isn't so much the word itself, but the lack of respect for authority. Do you guys agree that that's the problem here? That the students aren't respecting authority? Or do you think the authority is just kind of being a bit silly and a bit pushy? Yeah. All right. Mrs. Allen said, Mrs. Granger's right about that. There have to be standards. We can't have kids walking around saying ain't, can we? And that's when Nick piped in. You know, that big dictionary in Mrs. Granger's room? The word ain't is right there in the book. I looked it up, and there it was. I don't see why I can't use a word if it's in the dictionary. Mrs. Granger even said too that her big dictionary was the law. Nick looked from face to face to face. That stumped them all. He just launched his first class thought grenade. Well, yes, but, well, I said, the word ain't and even the word frindle, these are not the real issues, said Mrs. Chapman. Mrs. Allen said, well, I think the real issue is Mrs. Granger's reaction to a harmless little experiment with language. That's an overreaction, don't you think so, Tom? And Mrs. Allen looked at her husband. It was Mrs. Allen's turn to look from face to face to face. He was lost. Well, yes, sure. I I guess so. I mean, it's not like anyone's been hurt. Um, I mean, it's not like vandalism or stealing like that. His sentence trailed off, and he rubbed his chin and stared thoughtfully through the window on the wall behind Mrs. Chatham. And while the three grown-ups sat there in an uncomfortable moment of silence, Nick had a sudden vision of what was really going on here. It was a chess game. Nick against Mrs. Granger, and Mrs. Granger had just tried to end the game by using her queen, Mrs. Chantham, in her black raincoat, the Black Queen. Nick didn't know it until the attack was underway, but he had a powerful defender of his own, good old Mom, the White Queen, and the game was not over. It would go on until there was a winner and a loser. Mrs. Chantham didn't stay much longer. There was little more more talk back and forth across the chessboard about how children have the right to explore new ideas about importance of respecting teachers and the work they do, about everybody needing to keep up standards and make school a safe place to learn. Then Mrs. Allen offered Mrs. Chatham some coffee and banana bread, but she said, "No thanks, I really must be going now." She thanked Nick's parents, and they thanked her. Nick opened the door and said, Good night, Mrs. Chatham." Then the Black Queen put on her red scarf and walked into the October twilight. "Nick, I think we better talk a little more about this," said his mom, sitting back down on the couch. "If I find out you have been disrespectful to Mrs. Granger or any other teacher at school, then you really will be in big trouble." "I haven't been disrespectful. Honest. I did get everyone starting to use my word, but like you said, it's not hurting anyone. And I'm sorry if me and Dave and Pete got everybody to ask Mrs. Granger to borrow a Frindle. That was mean, I guess. But she started it by making kids stay after school and write 100 sentences just for saying my word. All the kids liked using my word. It's just fun. That's all." "Well," said Nick's dad, "if it gets everyone upset and makes the principal come talk to your mother and me, then it must not be fun for everybody, is it? I think you should just tell your friends to knock it off right now. I mean, tomorrow." Nick shook his head. "I can't, Dad. It won't work. It's a real word now. It used to be just mine, but not anymore. If I knew how to stop it, I think I probably would, but I can't." And Nick looked at both of their faces to see if the idea was sinking in. It was. "Like I said, I won't be disrespectful, but I do like my new word, and I guess now we're going to have to see what happens." And the chessmen, Nick's king and queen, had to agree. The game would go on. Let's see how long this next chapter is. All right. How many pages do we have left? Should I read another chapter? Yes, I'm seeing a yes. All right, I'll read one more. Chapter 10. Freedom of the Press. Judy Morgan was a reporter for the Westfield Gazette, the local newspaper. Westfield was a quiet little town. There was an occasional burglary. The teenagers got rowdy once in a while, and there was some shouting at the town councilor or planning board now and then. But mostly things were calm and orderly in Westfield. Every Thursday, the Westfield Gazette proved it. Ted Bell sold advertisements for the paper, and he had a daughter in fourth grade at Lincoln Elementary. He told Judy a bunch of fifth graders were making trouble and were not obeying teachers anymore. That there was something about a secret code word they were all using. And half of the students had been kept after school one day last week, including his own little girl. The only other story Judy was working on was about 18 new trees that were going to be planted along East Main. The trees could wait. This thing at the elementary school sounded like a real story. So, Judy Morgan showed up at Lincoln Elementary School at 3 o'clock the day after Mrs. Chatham had been to Nick's parents. The sign on the door said, "All visitors must report to the office." And she did. On the bulletin board outside the office, Judy saw Mrs. Granger's notice about the punishment for using the word Frindle. She stepped back 2 paces, aimed her camera at the notice, and snapped a photo. She read the notice once more and then stepped into the office. Mrs. Freed, the school secretary, looked up and smiled. "May I help you?" "Yes, I'm sure you can. My name is Judy Morgan, and I work for the Westfield Gazette. I'd like to know about that paper outside the office, the one about this word Frindle. Who should I talk to?" Mrs. Freed stopped smiling. She was sick and tired of anything to do with that word. For the past week, her phone had been ringing off the home hook. If it wasn't a parent complaining about a child who had to stay after school, it was someone from the school board trying to get in touch with Mrs. Chantham or Mrs. Granger. Mrs. Freed pursed her lips and narrowed her eyes. She said, "You'll have to speak with the principal. Let me see if Mrs. Chantham is free." She was. There isn't a principal alive who won't take time to talk to someone from the local newspaper. The reporter was invited into Mrs. Chantham's office. Judy noticed right away the word principal was not was not comfortable. Sorry. Judy noticed right away that the principal was not comfortable talking about this stuff. When she asked about the poster outside the office door, Mrs. Chantham laughed and said, "Oh, that? It's nothing really. Some kids have been playing a prank, and it was time to put a stop to it." The principal's laugh sounded phony to Judy Morgan. "And did that notice put an end to the prank? I heard a lot of children were kept after school last week. Would you tell me a little bit about that? Parents would like to know what's going on." Mrs. Chantham looked like, well, like a kid who had been sent to the principal's office. She squirmed a little in her chair and tried to smile. She said, "Well, we do have a little problem, but it's under control. Mrs. Granger may have overreacted a bit. I don't think the children have been really trying to be disrespectful. They're just having some fun, and it's more like a difference of opinion." And then Mrs. Chantham went on to tell the reporter what she knew about the word Frindle and how it had become popular among the students. Judy Morgan took careful notes. And when the principal finished, Judy said, "Would you mind if I asked Mrs. Granger a few questions?" Mrs. Chantham said, "No, not at all." But Judy could tell the principal wished she would just go away. What could she say, though? Mrs. Chantham couldn't very well keep the reporter away from Mrs. Granger, because after all, America is a free country with a free press. If Judy really wanted to, she would talk to Mrs. Granger sooner or later. It was sooner. In 3 minutes, Judy Morgan was standing in the doorway of room 12, looking in at Mrs. Granger. There were about 15 children sitting at desks scattered around the room, busy writing their 100 sentences. She knocked, and the teacher and students looked up from their work. "I am Judy Morgan from the Westfield Gazette. Mrs. Granger, may I have a word with you?" Mrs. Granger stood and came out into the hallway and closed the door. Judy could see past her and saw every kid in the room was strained to listen. Judy noticed Mrs. Granger's eyes right away. Gray, maybe flecked with a little gold, and very sharp, but not hard or mean, just bright and strong. The reporter didn't waste words. "So I hear you plan to stop the students from using their new word? How goes the battle?" Mrs. Granger did not smile. Her eyes got even brighter. "First of all, it's not a battle. I am merely helping the students see that this foolishness should stop. Such a waste of time and thought. There is no reason to invent a new word, a useless word. They should each learn the words we already have. But of course, all of this is just a silly fad. And when you add an E to fad, you get fade. And I predict that this fad will fade." Judy looked up from her notepad and asked, "Any idea how it got started?" Mrs. Granger's eyes seemed to almost catch fire at that question, and she said, "Yes, I have a very good idea how it all got started. It was one young man's idea, a fifth-grade student named Nicholas Allen. And now you will have to excuse me, Mrs. Morgan, for I have papers I must grade." And with a brief and firm handshake, Mrs. Granger ended the interview. The reporter didn't leave right away. She walked back through the hallway and sat on the bench outside the office so she could look over her notes and make sure they made sense. It took her about 5 minutes. Then Judy stood up, put her notepad in her large black purse, waved goodbye to Mrs. Freed, and headed out the door. As she walked to the parking lot, 5 or 6 kids who had just finished writing their sentences for Mrs. Granger came out the door. Judy walked past them, listening to them joke and laugh. Then she asked them, "Why do you kids keep saying Frindle? Do you hate staying after school?" A boy who was almost falling over from the weight of his backpack looked up at her and smiled. "It's not so bad. There's a bunch of my friends there. I've written that sentence 600 times now." And then the kids said Mrs. Granger didn't even look at their punishment papers anymore. They were sure because they were supposed to write, "I am writing this punishment with a pen." Everyone was writing the word Frindle every fourth or fifth sentence, and Mrs. Granger hadn't noticed anything. So instead of writing, "I am writing this punishment with a pen," occasionally they'll throw in, "I am writing this punishment with a Frindle," and she wasn't even noticing. One girl bragged that she had even written the word Frindle 45 times on her sheets today. She grinned and said, "That's a new record." "And this boy named Nick," Judy asked, "has he had to stay after school too?" The kids giggled, and a tall boy with reddish-brown hair and glasses said, "Mrs. Granger has kept Nick after school so much that everyone thinks she wants to adopt him." The reporter smiled. "Do you think I could find Nick and talk to him this afternoon?" The boy looked at Judy for a second and said, "I don't think Nick would want to talk to you right now. He might just say something stupid and get himself in trouble." Then he grinned at his friends. The kids laughed and poked and punched each other and headed off back down the block. Judy drove back to her office and started writing. See all of her notes there. The next morning, a brown envelope arrived at the Times-Gazette offices addressed Judy Morgan, and below her name was written Frindle Story. When Judy opened it, there was a class picture, the 5th grade at Lincoln Elementary School. Mrs. Granger and the 6 other teachers were standing at the ends of the rows, and the kids were dressed neatly, hair all combed, but there was something odd about the picture. The reporter looked closely and saw that each kid was holding up a pen, and each little mouth was puckered the same way. She was puzzled for a second, but then she said softly, "Of course, they're all saying Frindle." Written on the back of the picture in neat cursive, written on the back of the picture in neat cursive was, "Third row, 5th from the left." Judy looked at the picture, and there she saw the same grinning, red-haired boy with glasses that she talked to in the school parking lot yesterday. She chuckled and said, "Well, well, well, pleased to meet you, Mr. Nicholas Allen."